Anastasia glared at her father, feeling his indifference to her life choices. It seemed to her that he didn't care who she would marry as long as she could be sold at a higher price. Sergei Ivanovich, on the other hand, calmly explained to his daughter that a marriage with Kyle was the best opportunity for her to establish herself in this world. He's wealthy and promising, can't you see that? He's highly educated, and with your medical background, you won't even notice a shadow of sorrow. Why do you like my medical education? Anastasia inquired. I do like it. I just don't understand why you need him in our family business. I regret letting you study at that university. What's the point of a diploma when you've been working as my assistant for a year now? Her father replied. Dad, Anastasia exclaimed. Why, Dad? I genuinely regret not standing my ground earlier. But now, everything will be different. You will marry Kyle, and that's it. Your wedding is set for April 25th. In 3 months? Are you kidding me? I don't even know him. You'll meet him today. Besides, you should be content knowing that I know him. My driver will pick you up and take you to the restaurant. Sergei hugged and kissed his daughter. Now, be a good girl and don't be late. That evening, Anastasia sat across from a tall, handsome man, unabashedly studying him as she envisioned him as her husband. At the same time, he was engaged in conversation with Sergei, and the discussion revolved around business, leaving Anastasia visibly bored. Kyle was the first to notice this, and, with a polite smile to Sergei, turned his attention to the young woman. Excuse us, we seem to have gotten carried away with a less interesting topic for you. Indeed, Sergei supported him. He checked his watch and shook his head. Please forgive me, but I have another meeting in 15 minutes, so I'll take my leave. Kyle, you won't leave my daughter and will escort her home later, will you? Oh, don't worry, the men bid their farewells and Sergei departed. Everything happened so quickly that Anastasia was taken aback and only snapped back to attention when Kyle once again sat next to her and gazed into her eyes. What a pleasant evening, isn't it? Over the next 2 weeks, such evenings became a frequent occurrence. Kyle turned out to be an attentive and quite romantic companion. He could anticipate Anastasia's desires and often surprised her with delightful gestures. Now the young woman was convinced that her father had been right, and Kyle was the man with whom she could share her life and find happiness. One day, while getting ready for a date with Kyle, Anastasia suddenly felt unwell. She called her fiancé and told him she would stay at home. Can I come over? He asked. No, it's not necessary. It's nothing serious. I'll take some medicine and rest. All right, dear, we'll talk tomorrow. Anastasia did go to bed, but a phone call kept her from falling asleep. It was her friend. Vilya, where are you? Her friend asked. At home, Ketya. I'm feeling unwell. Oh, that's too bad. Your Kyle is having a great time here. You know where? At the nightclub. He's surrounded by some hot girls. You should see it. Then you want to come over. If not, I can play paparazzi for you. I'll get you some photos, babe. Anastasia looked at the photos and felt her rosy view of Kyle crumble, the one she had built in her mind. What did she really know about this man? Nothing. She burst into tears. The next morning, she went to Kyle's house to have a conversation and get everything cleared up. He answered the door, looking surprised and half asleep. What are you doing here? He asked. Sorry, I just came to talk. This is very important. Anastasia slipped into the apartment and suddenly froze, standing at the open door. In the bedroom, a young woman lay sprawled across the bed, covered only by a thin sheet, revealing the beautiful contours of her body. Kyle pulled Anastasia's hand and led her to the kitchen. I hope you're not planning to make a scene, he asked, furrowing his brow. I assume the wedding is off. Well, why not? The wedding is on. We have an agreement with your father, and we will continue to develop the business together. So everything remains the same. Our marriage is a done deal. So does that mean I can have my affairs too? You're not planning to leave your, whatever you call her? Don't overstep. And don't forget that I am a man. Got it? Yes, Anastasia understood. That's why she looked at Kyle and asked, so our marriage is beneficial to you, right? Okay. Anastasia left, got into her car, and drove away from the fiancé who had become repugnant to her. She drove without a clear destination in mind. Suddenly, she saw a lone young man standing on the road, hitchhiking. She stopped, he approached, a little embarrassed. But then he asked if she could give him a ride to a specific address. Get in, let's go. Thank you, the stranger said. I've been standing here for a while and no one would stop. Why didn't you call a taxi? I don't have that much money, unfortunately. Oh, really? Are you in need of money? Yes, very much. What's your name? I'm Matthew. I'm Anastasia. "Matthew, I have a proposition for you. Don't be surprised, but marry me, and I will pay you whatever is needed." Matthew looked at this strange girl in amazement, thinking she was joking. However, she repeated her request quite seriously and even explained why she wanted to do this. Matthew turned away and looked out the window, then suddenly named the amount she should pay him for the marriage stamp in the passport. And so, some time later, Anastasia became Matthew's wife, without telling any of her relatives. After signing the papers, they parted ways, both content with the deal. Anastasia got her marriage certificate, and Matthew got the money. She also didn't see Kyle, and he, after calling her several times, assumed everything was fine. A week before the wedding, Sergei Ivanovich came to his daughter and asked if she had chosen her wedding dress. "No," she replied shortly. "Are you out of your mind? What are you waiting for? Let's go now. I have some free time." "I don't have free time. I dedicate all my time to my husband now." "To whom? What are you talking about?" "To my husband, Dad, my husband. Yes, I got married without your consent, I'm sorry. But you didn't ask for my consent for the marriage to Kyle either. Don't believe me? Here's the marriage certificate and passport." In response, Sergei slapped his daughter on the cheek. "You brat, you've messed up all our plans. How dare you, you wretch." For about half an hour, her father yelled at her. Then he grabbed her hand and dragged her to Eva's. They rode in silence for a long time until they reached a village. "Where have you brought me?" "To your husband. That's his palace. Go in." "Dad, get out, and remember, I have no daughter anymore." Sergei left her at the humble house, and after creating a cloud of dust, he drove away. Anastasia stood by the road for a long time, watching her father's departing car. Then, hesitantly, she approached the unassuming house. She entered the yard, looking around, but suddenly stopped when Matthew appeared on the porch, looking at her with surprise. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I came to live with you," Anastasia replied challengingly. "Well, come in." Anastasia went inside and suddenly burst into tears. She had never expected to find herself in such poverty, and as she sat down on the old worn-out couch, she couldn't seem to calm her nerves. Matthew stood over her, unsure of what to do with this wife who had unexpectedly dropped into his life, a woman he had seen only a couple of times in his life. Eventually, he went into the kitchen, filled a glass with water, and brought it to her. "Here, drink this. It will help you calm down." Anastasia obediently took a sip and looked at Matthew with a sense of loss in her eyes. "I wouldn't have come if it weren't for my father." She sighed and proceeded to explain her situation to her husband, who was now looking at her. "Well, I suppose we will have to live together then. I can't kick you out," he stated. "I won't be able to live here." Anastasia shook her head. In reality, one day followed another, and she struggled to adapt to her new life. She often cried at night, struggling to sleep on the creaky couch in the room Matthew had allocated for her. Velena had to rely on Matthew because her father had blocked all her cards and accounts. She had difficulty eating, disgusted by the rural food. Matthew, on the other hand, was quite indifferent to it and didn't insist, believing that once she got truly hungry, she wouldn't be picky about the food. Anastasia also couldn't get used to Matthew, a completely unfamiliar person with a gloomy and uncommunicative disposition. It was fortunate that he was often not at home, allowing her to relax, knowing that she wouldn't have to endure his presence. Her evenings felt long and lonely. One night, Anastasia stepped into the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water and suddenly heard muffled sounds coming from behind the bedroom door. She tiptoed closer to listen, and through the door, she could hear faint sobbing. Anastasia was taken aback. She wanted to go to him, ask what was wrong, but she couldn't muster the courage and hurried back to her room. When she woke up the next morning, Matthew was already gone, and he didn't return the next day either. Anastasia, inexplicably feeling pity for Matthew, began tidying up the house for the first time during her stay there. She fried some eggs, made sandwiches, and, exhausted from the unusual chores, lay down to rest. Matthew returned about 3 hours later, as the evening was setting in. Without saying a word to her, he went straight into his room. Anastasia was upset by his indifference, and, with determination, entered his room. "Are you planning to keep ignoring me like this? I've prepared food, cleaned the house, and you haven't even noticed. How can you be so insensitive and cruel? I'm beginning to regret ever getting involved with you, and I'll leave you tomorrow. Got it?" she exclaimed. "What? What'd you say?" asked Matthew in a strange tone, giving her a bewildered look that left her speechless. You. Anastasia struggled to find words and stormed out into the yard and then onto the street. Angry tears choked her, and she sat on a nearby bench. "Traitors! It seemed like everyone around her was a traitor, including Matthew. He took her money without flinching, just like that. He's no different from Kyle. They're all the same. Overwhelmed by hurt and despair, Anastasia began to cry. "Come on now, don't cry like this," a warm female voice nearby comforted her. "You're Matthew's young wife, aren't you?" "I'm his neighbor, Aunt Dasha." Anastasia looked up and saw the pleasant face of a woman in her 50s. Daria sat down next to her and placed her hand on Anastasia's knee, soothing her gently. "There's nothing you can do when fate takes its course. Matthew walked past me earlier. He told me everything. I feel so sorry for Cordelia, terribly sorry, and as for little Sasha, it's unspeakable. Oh, what a bitter tragedy." Anastasia realized Daria was talking about something she didn't know and asked her talkative neighbor, "Could you tell me more about this family? I don't know them well." Daria replied, "What is there to say? They're just like any other family. Both parents have been gone for about 10 years now, one after the other. What's left is their elder daughter, Cordelia, and the younger one, Matthew. By that time, Cordelia had already turned 18, and she took on the responsibility of raising your husband. She was like a mother to him, and didn't marry until he grew up. They were quite close to each other. Later, Matthew stayed here in the family home, and Cordelia moved to the city where she got involved with someone, but it didn't work out, so she divorced rather quickly. She managed to have a child, Sasha, before that. She raised him on her own. Not long ago, she was in a taxi accident when she was on her way to visit Matthew. Both she and the taxi driver died on the spot. They were sitting in the front. Joe, her boyfriend, spent a long time in the hospital. Matthew, only God knows how, managed to find the money for his treatment, but it was all in vain. The injuries were extremely severe. Yesterday, Matthew joined his mother and son. That's how it went. He's a truly good man, and you love him. You should cherish him," Aunt Dasha whispered. Anastasia, as if struck by those words, rose, expressed her gratitude to Aunt Dasha, and returned to the house. Matthew lay on the sofa, facing away from her. She sat beside him, pulled him close, and embraced him, gently rocking the grown man as though he were a small child. Suddenly, he felt her warmth and genuine concern, and he could no longer suppress the waves of his pain. From that moment, everything in their relationship transformed. Anastasia seemed to shed her fragile shell, becoming more vibrant and genuine. She developed a deep affection for Matthew, actively helping him in every aspect of their life, learning to cook, doing the laundry, and taking care of the cleaning. Matthew was always there for her. With Anastasia, life became easier and simpler for Matthew, and one evening he embraced her and kissed her. In response, she wrapped her arms around his neck. The last obstacle between them had crumbled. 6 months passed. One day, a dear visitor, Eva, pulled up to Matthew's house. Sergei stepped into the yard and was astonished to find his daughter and son-in-law dining under the shade of a linden tree. He stared in disbelief, hardly recognizing his daughter. He had come to take her back, expecting to see tears and hear pleas for forgiveness. But when he saw the happiness on their faces and noticed his daughter's rounded belly, he spoke quietly, stumbling over his words due to the overwhelming emotions. "Forgive me, my daughter, and you too, Matthew." Soon, Anastasia gave birth to twins, a girl and a boy. She adamantly refused to return to the city. The grandfather adored his grandchildren, and before long, Matthew's house was unrecognizable. In place of the small hut, a 2-storied beauty stood, filled with the cheerful voices of the family. Matthew worked alongside Sergei, and Anastasia managed the house and took care of the children, finding greater happiness than ever before in her life.